long before the rise of Bagan's golden and centuries before the Burmese language would dominate the land. A mysterious and advanced civilization laid the first bricks of Myanmar's ancient identity. They were called the Pyu. Who were they? Where did they come from? And how did they build the first city-states in this part of Southeast Asia? To find the answers, we journeyed back over 2,000 years, into the mists of prehistory, where myth and fact begin to intertwine. Around the 2nd century BCE, the Pyu people began a long southward migration. Originating from the highlands of what is now Yunnan province, in China, they were part of the Tibeto-Burman language family, a group that includes Burmese, Tibetan, and many smaller ethnic groups scattered across the Himalayas and Southeast Asia. What prompted this migration remains unclear. Climate shifts, pressures from stronger northern powers, or the lure of fertile lands could have been factors. But what is certain is this: the Pyu arrived in what would later become the heart of Myanmar. They settled in the Irrawaddy Valley, a region blessed with fertile soil, steady rainfall, and abundant natural resources. This mighty river, flowing from the mountains to the sea, would become the lifeblood of Pyu civilization, nurturing their crops, connecting their cities, and shaping their worldview. As the Pyu established themselves along its banks, they began to form more than just villages. They created some of the first urban centers in Southeast Asia. The earliest and perhaps most iconic of these centers was Bakthana, named after the Hindu god Vishnu, dating back to between 200 BCE and 100 CE. Bakthano revealed remarkable traits for its time. Excavations have uncovered grid-style city layouts, massive brick walls, palace-like buildings, and early Buddhist. This was not a tribal settlement, it was a planned city, showing evidence of administration, spirituality, and architectural ambition. From the beginning, the Pyu showed adaptability and foresight. They farmed rice and millet, raised cattle and pigs, and developed rudimentary irrigation systems. They also made use of river trade, exchanging goods with neighboring communities and, over time, far-flung cultures like those of India and China. By the 1st century CE, Pyu settlements were thriving. Their language, their writing, and their religious ideas began to evolve in fascinating directions. One of the defining breakthroughs of the Pyu civilization was their adoption of writing. Influenced by Indian scripts such as Brahmi, the Pyu developed their own form of writing, Pyu script, which they used to inscribe Buddhist texts, royal decrees, and trade documents. These inscriptions, found on stone and metal plates, offer a rare window into their thoughts, values, and societal structures. Religion played a central role in Pyu life. By the 3rd century CE, the Pyu had adopted Theravada Buddhism, likely through contacts with Indian monks and merchants. Unlike many ancient societies that adopted Hinduism or animistic beliefs, the Pyu embraced Buddhism with a sincerity that would shape Myanmar's future religious identity. The presence of stupas, meditation halls, and inscriptions referencing the teachings of the Buddha speaks to a population deeply connected to spiritual growth and moral philosophy. Bakthano eventually gave way to other major cities, each reflecting the Pyu's growing influence. Hallan, further north, rose to prominence around the 1st century CE. It was strategically located near Sultan iron resources Gi, for trade and industry. Then came Sri Kshetrabai, far the most influential Pyu city. Located near modern-day Phaya, Sri Kshetra became the capital of a flourishing kingdom around the 5th century CE. It boasted monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, and a cultural richness that impressed even Chinese envoys of the 10th dynasty. It's easy to forget that the ancient world was more connected than we imagine. Through land and sea routes, the Pyu became part of the Southern Silk Road, facilitating the flow of goods, art, and ideas between India and China. Indian religious texts, Chinese coins, And even Roman glass beads have been found at Pyu sites, proof that their world was expansive, not isolated. Despite their reach, the Pyu appear to have been a peaceful people. Chinese historical records from the 9th century describe them as gentle, law-abiding, and spiritual. There were few signs of militarism, and their cities lacked defensive structures typical of warlike civilizations. Instead, the Pyu invested in spiritual architecture, urban planning, and trade infrastructure, preferring diplomacy and cultural exchange over conquest. Today, the ruins of Pyu cities lie scattered across central Myanmar, often overgrown, silent, and undisturbed. Yet within these remnants live the echoes of a people who introduced writing, statehood, and Buddhism to Myanmar's heartland. They were the first true builders of Myanmar, laying the foundation on which future civilizations would rise. Though their names are not as widely known as later kings, the Pyu deserve a place of honor in the tapestry of Southeast Asian history. From the distant mountains of Yunnan to the fertile plains of the Irrawaddy, the Pyu journeyed, settled, and thrived. Their legacy is carved not just in stone, but in the language, religion, and soul of a nation that would one day be called Myanmar. This is where the story begins. As the Pyu people spread across the Irrawaddy Valley, they did not forge a single kingdom, nor did they unite under one ruler. Instead, they created a constellation of independent cities, each thriving like a star in the vast night sky of early Southeast Asia. These city-states, fortified yet spiritual, modest yet innovative, would define the Pyu civilization and leave their mark for centuries to come. At the heart of Pyu society were these urban centers: Halin, Binaka, Mai Mau, and the largest of them, Alzari. Though not bound under a central monarchy, these cities shared language, religion, architecture, and trade networks, functioning like a cultural federation spread across hundreds of kilometers. Let's explore these ancient city-states and discover how they shaped early Myanmar. Bekthano, one of the earliest Pyu cities, rose around the 2nd century BCE. Located in the dry zone of central Myanmar, its design is a marvel of ancient urban planning. A rectangular city bounded by massive brick walls, nearly 3 kilometers long. Inside, archaeologists have discovered palaces, residential quarters, and Buddhist stupas. The city was laid out according to spiritual principles, geometry blended with cosmology. The Pyu est fusion of the material and the sacred. Bekthano was not just a spiritual center, it was also a hub of agriculture and trade. The surrounding lands were fertile, ideal for cultivating rice, sesame, and cotton. Farmers brought their produce into the city, feeding a population that lived not in chaos, but in planned quarters, reflecting a society that valued order, ritual, and community life. Further north, another city-state rose to prominence. Halin, built near salt-rich marshes. Halin controlled one of the most precious commodities of the ancient world: salt. Salt wasn't just a preservative or flavoring agent, it was a currency, a trade good, a necessity of life. Halin's economy flourished through salt extraction and metal, with remnants of iron smelting workshops and tools unearthed at the site. Its people, like those of Bekthano, practiced Theravada Buddhism, with inscriptions and stupas echoing the spiritual harmony that permeated all Pyu cities. But among all the Pyu city-states, none matched the grandeur of Si. Founded around the 5th century CE, Sri Khecher, meaning field of glory, was the largest and most influential of them all, spanning over 46 square kilometers. It was more than double the size of many contemporary cities in Asia. With thick walls, deep moats, and large circular stupas, Sri Khetra projected power, wealth, and spiritual devotion. Sri Khetra became the religious and cultural heart of the Pyu world. It hosted large monasteries, meditation halls, and sacred complexes filled with exquisite statues of the Buddha, many cast in bronze. an indication of artistic and metallurgical mastery. One of the most famous finds from Sri Ksetra is a group of royal burial urns beautifully decorated with floral motifs and Pyu inscriptions. These objects offer glimpses into the Pyu understanding of death, rebirth, and kingship. Sri Ksetra was also a powerful trade center, positioned between India and China, and connected to Southeast Asia through riverine and land routes. Sri Ksetra became a junction of the Southern Silk Road. Glass beads from the Roman world, coins from the Gupta Empire, and Chinese ceramics have all been found in Pyu cities, proof that these were not isolated backwaters, but globally aware urban hubs. Markets in Pyu cities bustled with activities. Silk, sandalwood, rice, ivory, and jewels changed hands under the watchful eyes of merchant guilds. Artisans worked in bronze, pottery, and lacquer. Monks walked silently through the streets collecting alms. And yet, despite the wealth and growth, the Pyu city-states showed little interest in military conquest. Unlike later kingdoms obsessed with territorial expansion, the Pyu appeared to favor diplomatic coexistence. Chinese envoys during the Tang Dynasty described the Pyu people as kind, peaceful, and law-abiding. Their cities had defensive walls. Yes, but they were more for symbolic boundaries and flood control than for warfare. This suggests a unique ethos in Pyu governance, one rooted more in spiritual authority than brute force compared to their contemporaries in India or the Khmer region. Pyu city-states stand out for their early integration of urban planning, religion, and administration. Their city layouts reflected mandala cosmology, with central stupas representing the spiritual axis of the world. Streets radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, and administrative buildings were positioned with intentional symmetry, blending the sacred with the civic. This spiritual civic harmony made the Pyu attractive to outside powers. Indian monks likely saw the Pyu as ideal disciples of Theravada Buddhism. Chinese emissaries respected their wisdom and order. In 802 BC, a Pyu mission to the Temp's court in China left a lasting impression. The Chinese noted their music, their refined customs, and their devotion to peaceful governance. Though the Pyu city-states never formed an empire in the traditional sense, their influence was wide and deep. Their cities were not built on conquest, but on connectivity between people, between cultures, and between this life and the next. They laid the very blueprint for urban civilization in Myanmar, guiding future kingdoms like Bagan in architecture, spirituality, and diplomacy. The Pyu city-states, with their grace and grandeur, stood as beacons of early Southeast Asian civilization. Their walls may now lie in ruins, but their spirit measured not in wars won, but in wisdom shared endures still in the soul of Myanmar. To understand a civilization, we must look not only at its cities or kings, but at the rhythms of its daily life, at how people ate, worshipped, worked, and dreamed. In this chapter, we enter the living world of the Pyu culture shaped by peace, religion, artistry, and order. By the height of their civilization between the 4th and 9th centuries CE, the Pyu had developed a structured, agrarian society. Most people were farmers, cultivating rice, millet, sesame, and cotton in the fertile plains of the Irrawaddy. Their techniques were simple, but effective, using oxen, wooden plows, and irrigation canals to sustain food supplies for the growing urban centers. These farmers, though humble, were the backbone of the Pyu world. Pyu homes were modest. In rural areas, they were made from wood and thatch. In cities, more durable materials like brick and tile were used. Archaeological digs at Hallan and Bacthano have revealed the standardized layout of residential zones, suggesting strong local governance and social cohesion. Beyond farming, craftsmanship thrived. Potters, blacksmiths, and textile weavers formed artisan classes, often working in family guilds. Beads, ornaments, and ceramics were not just functional but beautifully crafted, showing artistic flair and influence from India and China. Pyu society was not isolated. Through trade networks, urban markets were stocked with goods from across Asia: beads, silk, and iron tools. While coins were sometimes used, barter was still common, especially in smaller towns. The markets also acted as cultural crossroads places, where languages, ideas, and customs mingled. Religion formed the core of Pyu cultural identity. The Pyu were among the earliest adopters of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia well before its rise in Pagan. This is evidenced by hundreds of stupas inscriptions and ritual objects found across Pyu sites. Many of these inscriptions were written in the Pyu language, using an Indic script related to Buddhism. This makes the Pyu one of the first literate cultures in mainland Southeast Asia. Inscriptions include dedications to the Buddha of royal donations, and civic records suggesting a society where writing was linked to both spirituality and administration. Monasteries were more than places of worship, they were centers of education. Boys were ordained as novices, learning to read, recite Pali scriptures, and follow the Eightfold Path. Through the system, literacy spread not just among monks, but also among the urban lay population. In terms of dress, the Pyu wore garments adapted to the tropical climate: light robes, cotton tunics, and long pieces of cloth, wrapped like jewelry made of bronze, shell, or semi-precious stones, was popular among both genders, especially the upper class. Music and dance likely played roles in ceremonies and festivals. Although exact forms are lost to history, Pyu society was family-oriented and marriage rituals were simple, and evidence suggests monogamy was the norm. Social mobility existed. Those who excelled in religious service or artisan work could rise in status. Politically, each city-state had its own ruler or council, with elite classes overseeing local governance. There was no Pyu empire, but a confederation of allied city-states, sharing language, law, and faith. Administration likely drew on Indian models, with scribes, tax collectors, and royal officials maintaining civic order. Pyu kings were not warlords but Dhammarajas, righteous rulers who governed according to Buddhist moral codes. Their legitimacy was tied not to conquest, but to piety. Inscriptions describe royal donations to temples, land grants to monks, and vows to uphold the Dhamma. The symbol of the wheel, representing the Buddhist teachings, appears often in Pyu art. Unlike future kingdoms that built towering temples, Pyu stupas were squat, circular, and introspective, built more for quiet reflection than grandeur. Death, too, was rich. The Pyu cremated their dead and placed ashes in ceramic urns, often with inscriptions or protective symbols. These burial practices show both Buddhist and indigenous animist elements, perhaps reflecting the spiritual blending common in Southeast Asia. What did outsiders think of the Pyu? Chinese records from the Tang Dynasty describe the Pyu as a refined and peaceful people, governed by law, deeply religious, and culturally advanced. They admired the Pyu's music, their art, and their use of writing. In the Pyu world, society wasn't defined by conquest or cruelty, but by order, kindness, and contemplation. A culture where the plow was mightier than the sword, where monks walked barefoot through city streets, and where kings ruled not with fear, but with faith. It was this social fabric woven with compassion, discipline, and balance that made the Pyu civilization so unique. In the heart of the Irrawaddy plains, amid quiet fields and crumbling walls, rise the time-worn remains of a once spiritual world. A world where the sacred shaped the civic, where devotion wasn't confined to temples but infused the rhythm of daily life. From as early as the 1st century CE, the Pyu came into contact with Indian traders, monks, and missionaries. With this contact came more than goods, it brought faith. Buddhism, particularly the Theravada school, took root in Pyu soil, possibly through contact with Sri Lanka or South India. Over time, it blended with local animist traditions, forming a uniquely Pyu spiritual worldview. The Pyu practiced Theravada Buddhism, emphasizing personal morality, meditation, and the path to enlightenment. But they didn't abandon their ancestral beliefs. Enemies on the worship of spirits and natural forces remained deeply embedded in village life. Sacred trees, river spirits, and protective nets coexisted with Buddha images. This spiritual fusion created a culture of tolerance and inclusivity, echoes of which still survive in Myanmar today. Monasteries were the heart of Pyu, cities not just for worship, but for education and governance. Monks served as teachers, scribes, advisors, and even diplomats. Young boys entered as novices, learning Pali scriptures and basic literacy. Through this monastic system, literacy spread beyond royalty, reaching merchants and commoners alike. The Pyu were among the earliest literate cultures in mainland Southeast Asia. Hundreds of inscriptions, land grants, and teachings of the Buddha. Many were written in Pyu, some in Pali, and others even in Sanskrit, showing a multilingual, multicultural, religious elite. These texts were preserved on stone, metal, and terracotta, silent witnesses to the spiritual life of a civilization. The most iconic structures of Pyu architecture are their stupas, domed shrines housing Buddhist relics. Unlike later Burmese temples, Pyu stupas were cylindrical and solid, often built from brick without interior chambers. The largest, like Bobogya Trikasetra, still stands tall, over 46 meters high. Simple in form but monumental in scale, these stupis reflected the Pyu ideal of spiritual elevation through simplicity and symmetry. The design of the stupa followed Buddhist cosmology. The square base symbolized the earth, the dome water, the spire fire and air, and the umbrella, atop space and enlightenment. Pilgrims circled these stupas in clockwise meditation, reflecting on the Buddhist teachings. In Pyu city planning, religion influenced layout. Temples, stupas, and monasteries occupied central or elevated positions. Streets were aligned with cardinal directions, reflecting cosmic harmony. Water tanks, wells, and sacred trees surrounded these sites, emphasizing purity and balance. Art in Pyu temples was modest but meaningful. Sculptures of the Buddha often showed him in meditation or teaching, gestures mirroring the Pyu value of peaceful wisdom. Decorative tiles featured lotus flowers, mythical creatures, and sacred symbols. Unlike later kingdoms, Pyu avoided grandiose ornamentation. Their architecture spoke softly through proportion, repetition, and serenity. Death was not the end, but a cycle of rebirth. The Pyu cremated their dead, storing ashes in urns placed within sacred enclosures or city outskirts. Many of these urns were inscribed with mantras or symbols, meant to protect the soul on its journey. This integration of Buddhist and indigenous beliefs gave Pyu mortuary practices a uniquely compassionate and philosophical tone. The Pyu's religious commitment did not go unnoticed abroad. In 800 CE, Pyu envoys visited the Temp's emperor in Chang'an. Chinese records praised the Pyu as peaceful, law-abiding, and deeply Buddhist. Musicians, monks, and ritual dancers left such an impression that Chinese chroniclers describe Pyu as a model kingdom of virtue. In the Pyu world, temples rose not as displays of might, but as symbols of inner truth. Their stupas stood like mountains of faith, quiet, patient, enduring. Through their architecture and their religion, the Pyu built more than cities. They built a legacy of compassion, discipline, and balance, one that still echoes in the temples of Bagan, in the chants of monks, and in the soul of Myanmar. Water nourishes the land. Trade nourishes a civilization. For the Pyu, trade was more than just exchange, it was a highway for ideas, innovation, and influence. Let us step into the markets, ports, and caravan routes of the Pyu world. This is the story of their economy. The Pyu chose their homes wisely. Their city-states Bekthano, Halin, and Sri Kasetra were all strategically located along the Irrawaddy River or its tributaries. This vast waterway wasn't just for irrigation. It served as the artery of commerce, connecting the Pyu to neighbors and beyond. Goods, messages, and people flowed like the current linking farms to markets, temples to traders, and cities to civilizations. The Pyu didn't build one empire. They built a network of city-states, each with its own economy, but linked through trade and culture. These cities acted like economic hubs, collecting grain, pottery, and craft goods from villages and redistributing them through organized markets. Archaeological excavations reveal storage pits, grain, and tools used to measure volume, suggesting regulated commerce and taxation. So, what did the Pyu trade? Their cities were known for handmade pottery, including terracotta vessels that were used for both storage and religious offerings. They also traded in semi-precious stones, glass beads, textiles, and bronze tools. Salt, mined in central Myanmar, was another major good, critical for preserving food and valuable in regional trade. At the heart of the Pyu economy was agriculture. Fertile floodplains fed by the Irrawaddy allowed the cultivation of rice, millet, and sesame. Sophisticated irrigation systems, including embankments and reservoirs, helped maintain crop yields, even during dry months. Farming supported not only the local population but also created surpluses which were vital for trade and taxation. By the 3rd century CE, the Pyu weren't just trading locally. They were part of the vast Indian Ocean trade network. Their ports, likely on the Satang and Salween rivers, linked them to South India, Sri Lanka, and even the Roman Empire via intermediaries. Chinese historical texts like the Temps Annals mention Pyu envoys bringing jewels, elephants, and musicians to the Temps court. This shows how valuable and far-reaching Pyu exports had become. Trade wasn't a one-way street. The Pyu imported coins, metalwork, luxury ceramics, and religious manuscripts. Many of their Buddhist scriptures arrived from India and Sri Lanka. Indian influence can be seen in their language, scripts, religion, and even urban planning. But the Pyu made it there, unabsorbing, adapting, and innovating. Unlike later kingdoms, the Pyu civilization didn't have a widespread coinage system of its own. Instead, trade was often based on barter or measured units of grain, metal, and cloth. Indian and Chinese coins, however, have been found at Pyu sites, suggesting that foreign currency was accepted, especially in port cities. This hybrid system reflects a transition economy between a barter-based society and an early market-based one. A thriving economy needs skilled hands, and the Pyu had plenty. Excavations show evidence of potters, metalworkers, weavers, and stone carvers, each producing for both domestic use and export. Workshops were often located on the edges of cities, where access to water and transport routes was easy. These were not hobbyists but highly trained artisans, some likely attached to temples or royal courts. Trade didn't flow, frillet was regulated. The Pyu had a bureaucratic class, likely tied to the monarchy or temple system, that monitored land, labor, and taxes. Inscriptions from the era refer to land grants to monasteries, which received revenue from nearby fields. This system shows a partially centralized economy where religious and royal powers collaborated to manage wealth. The Pyu economy made such an impression that it was noted far beyond their borders. In 800 CE, a Pyu diplomatic mission visited Tangchaya. The Temps emperor described the Pyu kingdom as rich, orderly, and culturally advanced. He praised their music, their clothing, and their peace. Peace, of course, was made possible by prosperity. In the rhythms of rivers and the shuffle of marketplaces, The Pyu wove a silent empire, one not defined by conquest, but by commerce and connection. Their markets are long gone, their ports silted over. But the spirit of exchange, the idea that value comes from dialogue, not domination, still lingers. In Myanmar's temples, in its trade routes, in its soul. Every civilization rises with promise. And eventually, everyone faces the shadow of decline. For over 1,000 years, the Pyu but like rivers changing course, history too moves on. In this chapter, we explore the twilight of the Pyu and the legacy they left behind. By the 7th to 8th centuries CE, Sri Kshetra had grown into a major center of religion, diplomacy, and trade. The Pyu were sending embassies to Thames, China, receiving monks from India, and producing stunning bronze and stone sculptures. But beneath this prosperity, pressures were building: political, environmental, and military. Unlike centralized empires, the Pyu were a collection of loosely connected cities. As Sri Kshetra grew dominant, older centers like Bikthano and Hallan declined. Regional rivalries, possible disputes over resources, and lack of a unified military force weakened the cohesion of the Pyu world. With no strong central government, the Pyu were vulnerable, open to both internal decay and foreign invasion. Around 832 CE, a devastating blow came from the north. The Nanzhao Kingdom, based in modern-day Yunnan, launched raids deep into Pyu territory. These were no minor skirmishes; entire cities were sacked. Hallan and Sri Kshetra were among those targeted. Chinese sources describe the Pyu as being crushed and taken into captivity. After this, the Pyu never recovered their former stature. In addition to military threats, the Pyu faced environmental challenges, shifts in river courses, possible climate fluctuations, and overdependence on irrigation systems could have led to agricultural collapse in some areas. As trade routes shifted and farmland degraded, food security weakened, and migration increased. The once thriving city-states became ghost towns, their granaries empty, their people dispersed. But the Pyu did not vanish. Their legacy melted into the soil of Myanmar, absorbed by the peoples who came after. Most notably, the Bamar people, who began settling in the upper Irrawaddy Valley around this time, took inspiration from Pyu art, architecture, and governance. The rise of the pagan kingdom in the 9th and 10th centuries was not a break but a continuation. Many early pagan temples were built using Pyu-style bricks and inscriptions. The Pyu were among the first in Southeast Asia to use a written script derived from Indian Brahmi. This laid the foundation for the Burmese script, which continues in use today. Similarly, their Theravada Buddhist traditions, especially their monastic organization and emphasis on merit, shaped the religious practices of Myanmar for centuries. The Pyu helped lay the linguistic and spiritual foundation of the Burmese identity for centuries. The Pyu were a forgotten people, their cities hidden beneath the soil. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeological excavations at Hallan and Sri Kshetra revealed the true scope of their civilization. UNESCO declared the Pyu ancient cities a World Heritage Site. In 2014, acknowledging their importance not only to Myanmar, but to all of humanity. The Pyu finally re-entered the global stage not as ruins, but as pioneers of Southeast Asian civilization. The Pyu were not isolated. Their ideas spread beyond Myanmar to what is now Thailand, Cambodia, and southern China. The adoption of Buddhism, city fortifications, and urban planning models across mainland Southeast Asia owes a debt to Pyu innovation. Even the early Khmer and Mon kingdoms likely interacted with the Pyu, or inherited their systems through shared trade and religious networks. For decades, the Pyu were seen as a mysterious, almost mythical people. But modern research has shown they were technologically advanced, deeply spiritual, and highly organized. Once viewed as a prelude to the Bamar story, the Pyu are now recognized as civilizational pioneers in their own right. Their history is not a footnote, it is a foundation. Empires rise, and empires fall. But from their ashes grow the seeds of something new. The Pyu may have faded as a political power, but their spirit lives on in bricks, in words, in prayers, in the very DNA of Myanmar. They remind us that legacy is not measured in longevity but in impact. And in that, the Pyu endure. History is not just a collection of names and dates. It's the echo of lives once lived, of civilizations that dared to build, dream, and shape the world around them. The Pyu were one such civilization. Though their voices have long been silent, their legacy speaks through bricks still standing, through scripts still read, through faith still practiced. They were pioneers of a Buddhist culture that would shape the soul of Myanmar and Southeast Asia beyond. From the earliest city-states to the rise of empires that followed, the Pyu remain the foundations, the first heartbeat of civilization in this land. And in their rise, their fall, and their endurance, we find something deeply human. The desire to leave a mark, the struggle to survive change, and the hope that, somehow, we will be remembered. If this journey through ancient Myanmar moved you, if you want to explore more forgotten empires, untold stories, and living heritage, then subscribe to our channel. Join us as we bring Southeast Asia's history to life one chapter at a time.